I worked at Goldman Sachs and Capital Group, which is actually one of the world's largest investment funds. I've helped manage billions of dollars and have looked at hundreds of investments, everything from private companies to public companies in all sorts of different sectors. I've had conversations with CEOs at Fortune 500 companies and heard and observed the investment process of many hundreds of investors directly. And so in this video, the lesson I really want to hit home on is that competitive advantages, while important, are not everything. This other factor, which is usually not actually emphasized enough, is just as, if not much more important. And that is execution. And so if you think about Meta, Mark Zuckerberg always gets this sort of shade that he didn't come up with this idea. He stole it from the Winklevoss twins, but that's not actually true at all. In fact, there's many social network companies that existed way before Facebook and the Winklevoss twins. One of the first social networking companies ever was actually founded during the tech bubble in the late 90s. It was called 6 Degrees. The idea behind the name was that everyone is connected between 6 degrees of people, sort of like that old Chuck Norris joke that you could relate anything to him within 6 sort of nodes of separation. And so one of the reasons why that was not successful was execution. Now, you can't really blame him entirely because at the time, digital cameras weren't common, and so people couldn't even upload photographs onto their profile. And a social networking site without pictures of the person's profile is going to be a very hard sell. But nevertheless, you could still say that the execution missed. I think an even better example, though, and one that you probably heard of, is Friendster. Friendster was started in the early 2000s. This actually gained popularity with tens of millions of people on it, including Mark Zuckerberg himself. You could actually find pictures of his Friendster profile. And Friendster was very similar in idea to Facebook. It was a real name social networking site where people had their own profiles and they shared information and all sorts of other stuff. Sure, there was a lot of features that they didn't have that Facebook currently has, but when it was in its very early innings, it was very similar to Facebook. And the reason why it ultimately failed was focus, which is sort of a cousin of execution. They were very obsessed with trying to grow into many different markets. And you usually think of growth as being a good thing. However, that is not always the case. In fact, kind of ironically, one of the big keys to Facebook's success, where Friendster failed, was that Facebook actually gated its growth. They grew very slowly and deliberately early on. Facebook did this by only opening up at one college campus at a time. If you remember, it started at Harvard, and then they slowly opened it up to more Ivy Leagues, and then other colleges and universities as well. The importance of gating growth in doing it very deliberately is that it allowed them to put into place the proper systems to make sure they could service all of that growth without consumer experience degrading. That is a really important factor. Friendster, in contrast, did nothing like that. And a lot of people ultimately left Friendster because the load time on the pages were as much as 20 to 40 seconds. It's not hard to imagine that if you're staring at a web page for 40 seconds, that's not going to be a fun experience and you're going to want to leave, especially because a lot of the times people are on a social media site. It is a little compulsive. You're trying to kill a few minutes and maybe you get sucked into it. But when you're staring at a blank page, it's very easy to go, okay, there's other things I should probably be doing. And so Friendster ultimately unraveled. People started leaving the site, and once people leave because of the network effects, very quickly it unravels. But even after Friendster, there was another social networking company, and it made a very similar mistake to Friendster actually. That was MySpace. MySpace also started before Facebook and was much bigger. Very similarly, people had profiles. One of the differences between MySpace, though, was that it was very customizable. Now, people liked the customization, but it turned out a lot of that wasn't actually on purpose. It was because it was very poorly coded. MySpace was sort of incubated in this other bigger technology company that had all sorts of different internet ventures. And they were kind of actually known to spearhead a lot of spam emails and kind of cheap, crappy products. And from that, MySpace was actually born. And so you're not really talking about a business with a very clear sort of visionary. So when MySpace actually started gaining a lot of of traction, they tried to pivot a little bit and really put more resources into it, but they didn't really have that same sort of long-term mindset, which is a really important aspect of execution. And so they were making a lot of short-term decisions that they ended up having to pay for down the line. Now, if anyone had a MySpace growing up, you might have noticed that your first friend ever on it was someone named Tom. Now, Tom was the founder of MySpace, and if you're wondering why they did that, it was actually because they were having technological challenges figuring out who should be able to see whose profile. Because the idea would be if you didn't have any common friends, you couldn't see their profile. And so to get around this and to make everyone's profile searchable, they just added Tom as a mutual friend to everyone's profiles. That is why if you had a MySpace, your first friend was Tom. It was not because they just thought that that'd be a fun little quirk. It was actually a technical workaround to poor back-end architecture. And this really goes to exemplify what it means to not be thinking for the long term. Similar to Friendster, they always had server bandwidth problems. Now, no doubt, it is definitely very hard to be a very fast-growing internet company that's adding usage to the tune of 100% plus a month, really just insane numbers. And this is before you had the cloud providers that could help you with internet infrastructure. And so you were stuck on your own providing all of that. But that is also, again, why Facebook was very slow to grow initially, because they wanted to make sure they could handle all of that growth and demand without a poor consumer experience, knowing that if they did have a poor consumer experience, it would turn people off forever. In contrast, companies like MySpace wanted to grow really, really quickly, and they just tried to digest as much of that growth as possible. It's like MySpace went to a buffet and tried to eat every single food there in one sitting. They were constantly struggling to keep up with server demands. Ultimately, what ended up happening was News Corp's, Rupert Murdoch's company, ended up buying MySpace, feeling that that could potentially be sort of the future of media, is this sort of mix of social media and advertising on there would be synergistic with their other advertising on different internet publications they had. And so they bought them and they never adequately invested in it. This sort of business really would have taken hundreds, if not billions of dollars of just capital to build out the server needs to support all that compute. Furthermore, in order to build something like MySpace correctly, you really shouldn't just be throwing banner ads absolutely everywhere because it leads to a poor consumer experience. Now, this is again a short-term decision that a business will make to show profit, but it hurts them in the long term. The reason why you bombard your users with ads is not just because you care about having a good consumer experience, but it's actually better for you financially in the long run. If you enjoy a product more, you're going to want to stay on it more. And that is going to give the business more time to introduce different features that they can monetize or even advertise more. But it has to be done in a way that it doesn't intrude on your experience. Facebook and Instagram now too are kind of kings of this, where the advertising within the app is actually not just not intrusive, it's kind of one of the more enjoyable aspects people have on the app because the ads are so targeted to them. In contrast, MySpace would just throw on a SpongeBob movie banner on the homepage for everyone and just blast that everywhere, which maybe made them money in the short term, but ultimately it was kind of a weird sort of association. But ultimately it kind of hurt them in the long term. But the biggest thing and the reason why MySpace failed wasn't just the success of Facebook, but it was also because of all this tech debt catching up to them. Similar to Friendster, web pages were slow to load. On top of that, it was very hard for them to add new features because they had all this tech debt, which is sort of a word for when you build something very quickly and the technology evolves and you never adequately update the architecture of the backend, you get all of these issues. One of the sort of final nail in the coffins for MySpace was when Facebook rolled out Newsfeed. Newsfeed was a totally new innovation, the way to sort of get all of these updates on all of your friends and all of this content directly to you, and in a way that was algorithmically tailored to what you would preference most to see. MySpace couldn't even envision trying to do something like that. And that, of course, is where, at least initially, a lot of the time spent was on Facebook was because of this newsfeed. It really did allow people to discover more content easily. And so if we're thinking of kind of big lessons from why Facebook succeeded, where MySpace, Friendster, 6 Degrees failed, it really ultimately comes down to execution. It wasn't the idea. Many people had this idea before. They just out-executed them on it. And they really do deserve credit for that because that is not nothing. A lot of people can have an idea, but actually implementing it when you're dealing with the millions of problems that will come up in a given year and you have to solve them with the correct solutions, that it is really hard to do than it is to just come up and say, I have this idea for a social media site. Another quick example is Amazon. They also did something similar to Facebook where they gated growth initially. Jeff Bezos didn't start as a store that just sold everything, as some e-commerce sites tried to do initially. Instead, he said, we're only going to do books. We're going to do books very well. We're going to do books better than anyone else. And once we get leadership in books, then we're going to slowly expand out into other categories. What's tangential to books? They did music, which was CDs at the time, movies, DVDs at the time, which was enough to expand out their selection without it being too much to overwhelm them. They were very similarly to Facebook, they were very focused on the actual user experience in making these long-term decisions. And a long-term mindset really is kind of just another end of execution. Because if you're executing well, you're not making decisions for short-term fixes that you're going to have to go back and redo it later on. That's actually a reason why a lot of businesses fail is they do go for these kind of quick short-term fixes and then they try to patch it up later on. And so even if that means that Amazon initially uses FedEx and UPS instead of course building their logistics network right out on day one, it still means they are thinking for the long term. They have a plan, they have a progression. They know how to execute and they know the steps they need to take to get there. Another way that they would think for the long term is they would give free returns. And that certainly cost them in the short run, as some people took advantage of them, products just to test them and then returning them. And they could have kept that little bit of profit they made, but instead they said, we're going to think for the long term, and thinking for the long term and executing well for the long term in this case meant that we want the consumer to trust us. Trust is the most important thing. So we could get to the point that as soon as a consumer even thinks that they want an item, they just go to our site and buy it. And that was a multi-year process for Amazon. There's all sorts of other aspects of their execution where they're looking at these very specific KPIs. They're looking at how many steps are involved in picking an item and then putting it in the box and delivering it. It turned out that the best way to sort of organize their inventory was to actually randomize it instead of putting the same items next to each other, because then there's less likely that there's multiple people going to the same area for the same sort of popular items. And someone else actually figured out they could use a little bit of less tape in the boxes, and that also not just saved material, but it also made it cheaper and more efficient because it was quicker to box stuff. There's all sorts of experimentation they do, all this little bit of iteration to just make every little aspect of their operation quicker, more efficient. And that is all the execution aspect, making sure all of those little things work flawlessly and continuously. If you haven't heard of a company called Coupang, they are basically the Amazon of South Korea. Now, they are a really impressive company, though, because they started in 2009 and didn't even move to the sort of Amazon model until 2014. And at that point, there was dozens of other competitors in the South Korean landscape. They were eventually able to take a lead, though, by just out-executing everyone. The things they did, the items they decided to sell, they sold them better than anyone else. When there was a problem, they fixed it better than anyone else. They realized that instead of using boxes, they could use bags to ship items, and that was before Amazon was doing that. They learned how to reconfigure their vehicles so more packages can fit in an individual truck. They learned how to pre-sort items in the warehouse so that when it would get into the truck, there was less sort of fumbling around for different packages by the time the delivery man got to the apartment building. They used all sorts of robotics and automation in their warehouses to move stuff around. There's all of these little things that they get a little bit and a little bit better on that is really what allows them to stand out so much ahead of all of their competitors and take so much market share over time. Now, if you're looking at a boring business, though, like a home builder, you may say, what competitive advantages does a home builder have? Okay, sure, I can understand over time. Facebook has a network effect. Amazon also has a network effect, but they also have the advantage now of physical infrastructure. That's a very hard moat to overcome. They have also their Prime program, the loyalty, the retention, all the data they now have on their users, all sorts of different advantages. Okay, well, what about a business that kind of clearly has no competitive advantages? That would be home building. There's a company called NVR that kind of pioneered this whole new model of building homes that was so successful, their stock has been a multi-hundred bagger. What they would do different than the competition is that they didn't actually buy the land to build their home on ahead of time. Instead, what they did was they optioned it. Then when they were ready to build a home on it, they would exercise their option, giving them the land, and then they would very quickly build the home on it. They were able to build the home on it much quicker than other people because they had their own factories that prefabricated a lot of the siding for the walls, paneling, and they would buy in bulk a lot of different materials like toilets and stuff and build an entire little community all at once, which gave them this kind of local scale, which allowed them to not just buy stuff cheaper, but also get stuff done quicker. Because once you have a construction crew out there installing toilets, it's easier to do it in 10 homes than to just do it in one home, to have them come back and do it in a week later. On top of that, they don't actually start building the home until they know they have a purchase order for it. That is important because that means that they don't have to speculate that much by having homes sit on their balance sheet while they're paying construction interest costs. But on top of that, if there ever is a fallout in the market, they could end up losing money if they have to sell the homes at a discount in order to meet some sort of shorter term liquidity needs. This whole sort of model they built is something anyone can copy. Anyone can buy a land option. Anyone can start a factory to start to prefabricate some of the housing material. Anyone can buy toilets in bulk. There's no real competitive advantages in their business model. They just execute it and run the business so much better than anyone else. Old Dominion is another business like this, and they do something called less than truckload, which is basically just any sort of shipping where it's not a full truckload of stuff. And so they have to pick up stuff in different places, they bring it to a warehouse, they aggregate some of the items together, rearrange it, and then ship it back out to somewhere else. A pretty sort of simple business at a high level to understand. And there are many competitors in this space, except they have out executed all of them. In fact, they charge more for their services than their competitors, but people still choose to go with them. And it is because of the way they run their operations. They execute so well that they are more timely and more efficient in terms of pickups and drop-offs, which is really important because a business that needs to ship product out doesn't want it to just build up in their warehouse. Otherwise, they may have to shut down the factory because they can't produce anymore. They don't have space for all of that. They also need the material to get somewhere else quickly. On top of that, it could just mess up their supply chain. They're expecting material or product to get from point A to point B, and if it doesn't in that amount of time, they're slowing it down, they're causing supply chain issues, and so people are willing to pay up for a very competent shipping operator. On top of that, they break stuff less often. That's another sort of important aspect, because if you're breaking things, even if you're paying for them, and it can still cause issues in this operations, because anytime you have a business, you have all of these different steps that need to be done in a specific sequence, and if you disrupt one aspect of that sequence, then it's going to be hard to continue the rest. And then inventory builds up, you might have to shut down your factory or slow it down, then the workers are not getting paid as much, they're getting upset. Now you have upset workers who maybe not are working as well, that's causing other issues. You're slowing down your procurement, and because maybe there's long lead times though, and so you actually still want to go ahead and buy that material, but now it's building up in your warehouse, but you were actually factoring it, which means you're paying interest on it, and so now it's costing you more money. All sorts of issues happen, and so people are willing to pay up for a service that is on time and can deliver the way they said they would. Again, though, Old Dominion, if you look at it, it doesn't have like competitive advantages versus their peers. All their peers have a lot of customers, national footprints, all sorts of things. They're just a better run company. And being a better run company over time does become an advantage in and of itself. And one last example, which I think really just hits this point home, is Constellation Software. Constellation Software buys what are called vertical market software businesses. Now, these are just businesses that have a very niche software offering that serve a specific vertical. My favorite example is like chicken coop software. It might be a very little TAM, but it's very important if you're a chicken coop operator. That allows you to track, your chickens, how many eggs you have, when you're feeding them, when you're expecting them to lay more eggs, all sorts of things that are involved in that operation. Now, it's not a big market, but that software to that individual customer is really important. And there are all of these sort of niche applications across all sorts of different businesses. All Constellation Software did was find these businesses and not pay a high price and acquire them. That was it. And then the question is, how come that opportunity exists with all these private equity funds that, without exaggeration, have trillions of dollars of capital? You have all sorts of smaller private equity funds too. You have other software companies that can make acquisitions. How come this opportunity existed, and how come they're successful for 30 plus years? It's because they simply out executed other people. And that's a very hard thing to understand. Mark Leonard, who started Constellation Software and now is a multi-billionaire, is very fond of saying all the barriers to entry in our business are a phone and some capital. That's it. All you do is have to call someone up and try to buy their business, and you could try to copy them. And many people have actually. But crazy enough, almost none of them were that successful at it because it turns out that it is very hard executing on this. Anyone can buy a company, but buying a company without getting all the talent to leave immediately, without disenfranchising existing customers, without getting too aggressive in the pricing, with understanding how much to update the software offering without investing too much in it, and on top of that, building a reputation to actually take care of the business and not just be a mercenary coming in and slashing cost. All of these are aspects that they built up over time and has allowed them to be successful. So not just was this the case with Facebook initially and Amazon initially when they just started out, of course they had no competitive advantages. They just started out, but they were able to out execute the competition. And over time, they built their own competitive advantages. Very similarly, we just saw with these home builders, trucking, and then just acquiring companies, they also had no competitive advantages when they started. Even today, their competitive advantages are really not that strong. But having said that, they out execute the competition consistently. And so that is what I hope you got away from this video, is that when you're looking at a business to invest in, understand if they're executing well. Investors very commonly make this mistake where they're going to pick the business that's cheaper, but they know it's not as good of a quality of a business, not as well run, but it's cheaper. And so they go and buy that one. And what they find out is that they get what they paid for, because a less well run business over time tends to just bleed value all over the place. Whereas a business that is very well run, it's much more likely to retain its customers and add more value to them over time. And as they continue to do that, they will be able to monetize a portion of that value. That is why being just a well-run company can actually be an advantage, even if you are in a very competitive industry. And so if you have any questions though on this, or you want me to clarify anything at all, go ahead and drop some questions in the comments below. But if you want to learn more about business and investing, make sure you hit subscribe so you could continue to follow along as we talk about all sorts of different aspects in business and investing.